Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I got a lot of requests for the Crocodile deck list that I used in the last gameplay video I posted featuring Blue Crocodile versus Katakuri, so I figured why not just make a deck profile on it. So this deck list, it's pretty straightforward. There's a lot of 4-ofs. This is usually a deck that I test on the side and just play for fun. So there is a lot of wiggle room with the ratios, but this has performed really well whenever I do get a chance to play it. So yeah, I do think that it is a strong deck. There are a few drawbacks to it that I'll go over, but let's just jump into the deck list. So starting off, we have the Crocodile Leader from set 1, the 7 Warlords of the Sea starter deck, and his ability, activate main once per turn. Don -4, you may return a character with a cost of 5 or less to the owner's hand. So this is just really good. You typically want to use this on your opponent to close out games, to bounce a blocker back to their hand, or maybe just take away one of their swings. So it's a really good momentum play, and it's good for closing out games. Next I play for Kaya. She's mostly a 2k counter, but she is pretty useful to put into play as well, because for 1 Dawn you get to put her into play, and her on-play ability is to draw 2 cards and trash 2 cards from your hand. So she's a good filter for your deck if you're just trying to get to maybe your Sentomaru on turn 2 if you didn't get it in your opening hand, or possibly your Mihawk to play on curve. So yeah, she's not too bad, but mostly used as a 2k counter. Next up, I have 4 copies of the 1-cost blocker Trafalgar Law from the starter deck. There's a lot of ways to remove small blockers in this format, so the ratio on this is definitely one that can change, but I just put in 4 because a blocker for 1 cost is just really good value. Next up is the MVP of the deck for sure. It's Sentomaru. This is also from the 7 Warlords of the Sea starter deck. So Sentomaru, Dawn ×1, activate main once per turn. You may rest 2 Dawn and search your deck for a Pacifista and put it into play, and then shuffle your deck afterwards. So this is the card that establishes a board for you. So you search your deck, you can put out the blocker Pacifista or the 4-cost 6k vanilla Pacifista. You just put Sentomaru onto the board as soon as possible, and as soon as you can use that ability, you just start putting out a bunch of attackers or blockers depending on how you want to play the deck and whatever you need for that moment. So yeah, Sentomaru is definitely an MVP, and it's a card that your opponent will prioritize getting off of the board as soon as possible. Next up, we have the blocker Doflamingo. So low cost blocker again, just like the Trafalgar Law, but this one has a little bit better stats and it's a little bit harder to remove. But on play, you get to look at the top 5 cards of your deck and rearrange them in any order. So this just makes your deck really consistent, and you can choose to bottom deck those cards as well if there's nothing in there that you like. It's a card that I think most blue decks run at 4 copies. Next up, we have Bartholomew Kuma. So this is another card that works really well in this deck because it's a blocker, and whenever it is KO'd, you get to play a Pacifista with a cost of 4 or less from your hand into play. So it gets removed from play, and then you get to put down a Pacifista in its place. So there can be some really amazing plays that you can pull off toward the end, especially like if you have the blocker Pacifista, you essentially are playing 2 blockers for 4 Dawn, and it can sneak up on your opponent and mess up their plans in the end game because they think, oh, he only has 1 blocker up. But no, you put down another blocker Pacifista after he's KO'd, and yeah, it can just really change the end of games for you. So yeah, it's really cool, some of the plays that you could pull off with Bartholomew Kuma, and he's definitely a card that I would run 4 of in this Crocodile deck. Next up, we have the 4-cost 5k blocker Pacifista. So I run this at 4 copies. You could have multiple copies in the deck. This is another one you can probably change the ratios on. It doesn't have a counter, so that's kind of a drawback for it, but it does have blocker. It can be searched out by Sentomaru and put into play with Bartholomew Kuma, so I really like having this card in the deck. I just don't know what the ratios would be, so right now I just put it at 4. Next up is probably my favorite card for blue. It is the Gecko Moria. He's a 4 cost, 5k power, and on play you get to add 1 7 Warlords of the Sea or Thriller Bark type pirate card from your discard with a cost of 4 or less and add it to your hand, other than Gecko Moria of course. So this card is great because it's basically a late game search, because you can search your entire discard for any of the cards that you've played up to that point that have the 7 Warlords of the Sea or Thriller Bark Pirates type. So you can get your Mihawk back as a 2k counter, you can get your Law back or your Doflamingo back for low cost blocker. So I just really like Gecko Moria in blue, and it provides something that not a lot of decks have. There is the Uta for red, but she doesn't have counter, so it's really nice to have a 1k counter on this Gecko Moria card. Next up we have the Draco Mihawk 2k counter from the starter deck. It's a 4 cost, 5000 power, and it does have a useful ability. Down ×1 when attacking, draw 2 cards and trash 2 cards from your hand, so you get the Kaya effect there, but it's when you're attacking instead. So it's a decent attacker, and it does filter through your hand to get the most optimal cards in your hand. So yeah, I really like Draco Mihawk. Most of the time he is a 2k counter, but definitely not a bad attacker in a pinch. Next up, we definitely run 4 copies of the 4-drop 6k Vanilla Pacifista. He's just a really good attacker, solid stats, 1k counter, and he is the card you're most likely going to search with your Sentamaru or put into play with your Bartholomew Kuma. He's the card that you want to flood your board with and just provide a lot of pressure. You know, you throw 1 Dawn under him and he's a 7k attacker that you got to put onto the board for value. So the Pacifista engine really just makes this deck work so well. Next up we have the Secret Rare Soga King, who is a 7 cost with only 6000 power. But he does have a 1k counter, which is kind of nice for a top end card. You also treat this card's name as Usopp according to the rules. I'm not really sure why. But on play, return up to 1 character with a cost of 6 or less to the owner's hand, then draw 2 cards and trash 2 cards from your hand. So once again, we have another card that just filters your hand, and being able to bounce a 6 cost is pretty good momentum. So this is the card that replaced the 7 cost 7k power Dofi from the starter deck that bounces a 7 cost. There's not too many 7 cost cards to bounce. 6k is a pretty good number, but just having that 1k counter and having the ability to filter your hand is just really solid. So I only played 2 copies of this card. It's a good card to put onto the board, but it does lack a little bit of power, but the utility is nice. It's possibly a card that you could run 4 of, but I've seen lists that don't run any, so yeah, it's not a bad card. Next up we have the boss monster for blue. At the moment we have Draco Mihawk. Draco Mihawk is a 9 cost, 9000 power, and on play you get to put a card with 7 cost or less to the bottom of the owner's deck. So it's a bot decking card, which is a lot better than bouncing, and it's just a huge momentum swing whenever you can bottom deck one of your opponent's 7 costs or less, and he provides a lot of offense. And yeah, it's just a no-brainer. I think you include 4 copies in this deck for sure. Next up, we have the 3000 Worlds event card. This card is kind of what made blue a lot more playable in set 3. You get to place 1 character with a cost of 5 or less to the bottom of the owner's deck. So just like Mihawk, it is a bottom deck card. It doesn't put a character onto board for you, so it's not as big of a momentum swing as Draco Mihawk, but it's still really good because bottom decking a 5 cost. It's just hard removal. It's like Jet Pistol for blue, and blue really needed a card like this to kind of keep up a little bit. It does also have a really nice trigger to place 1 character with a cost of 3 or less to the bottom of the owner's deck, so it's not quite a 5 cost, but sometimes getting this play for free is really nice. You could get rid of Rush Zoros or, you know, low cost blockers, so it's definitely an amazing card that I play 4 of. Next up, I just play 4 copies of Love Love Beam. It's a really good counter event for 2 Dawn. You give your leader or one of your characters up to 4,000 power during this battle. Then draw 1 card if you have 3 cards or less in your hand. You know, it's a card that we've had for a while, and it's one of the best counter events in the game. That is the deck list. Like I said before, there's a lot of 4-ofs here just because it just works, you know. This deck works. If I were to fine-tune this list, maybe the ratios would be a little bit different, but there are definitely some cards that I've considered for this list, so I'll jump into those. We only play 8 2K counters here, right? So having another 2K counter like Alvida or maybe Bond Clay from the Impel Down package would be worthy inclusions for sure. A lot of the time I don't like to go less than 10 2K counters, but with blue it's a little bit more forgivable because you run so many blockers, and you do have Gecko Moria to get back the Dracula Mihawk, and Level Up Beam as a counter event is also really nice. So blue has a lot of defense, but having more 2K counters is always nice. Another consideration for this deck is the 6 cost 8,000 power vanilla Dracula Mihawk. So that would give us a 3rd Dracula Mihawk for this deck, but he has a lot of good cards. If you're able to drop this card on curve at your 6 Dawn turn and then have that 8K swing for the rest of the game, that's just pretty huge. You know, you tuck 1 Dawn under it, that's a 9K swing. That's a lot of counter. It gets around a lot of counter events. So yeah, I just think that this is a really strong inclusion. Definitely some cards you can cut to make room for this as well. The last card that I would consider is actually Gum Gum Rain. So there's a few colors that have this counter event. It's a 0 cost, so that's really nice. And you just trash 1 card from your hand and give your leader or one of your characters plus 3,000 power during this battle. And it also has a trigger to return up to 1 character with a cost of 2 or less to the owner's hand. So there's a few cards that you can use that for, but you know, most of the time I'm going to put that card to my hand because it's a card I can use instantly since it's a 0 Dawn investment. So yeah, those are some cards I would consider. Just adding a little bit more defense, or in the case of Mihawk, just a little bit extra power, like raw power to the deck. But yeah, definitely some wiggle room for these cards. Now I guess it's time to get into some of the matchups. If you go watch my gameplay video, you'll see that Crocodile can go toe-to-toe with Katakuri and all yellow decks because yellow has a hard time dealing with low-cost blockers, and it doesn't have much removal in general, so you can play down your Sentomaru and feel pretty safe. You don't have to attack with the Sentomaru until it makes sense to, so you could just flood your board, and I think that yellow kind of struggles against decks that do flood the board because they do discard a lot of cards to put some of their characters into play or use some of their triggers, so their hand kind of runs thin at that point. And they do play a few non-counter cards at the top end, so if their hand is cluttered with top end, then you can just provide multiple swings and take all their life in 1 turn. So yeah, you can close out games from pretty far out. Another thing I'll say that's in Blue's favor is you can take away a swing with Crocodile's ability toward the end. So yeah, another matchup that is worth talking about, I think, is the Red Zora matchup. So Zora can throw a lot of swings at you pretty quickly, right? But you take away a few of those swings with blocks and maybe play more of a board control style game. You just swing into their lower bodies with your leader, and being able to bottom deck a Marco with 3,000 worlds is pretty huge, since if you remove it in other means, like with a jet pistol for example, or if you just attack into it, then they can just discard an event and put it back into play. So sometimes when you're going after Marcos, it feels like you're spinning your wheels, but being able to bounce it at the right time or being able to bottom deck it is something that you have to your advantage in Blue. So yeah, it's a little bit of a back and forth because they do have access to Fire Fist, which Sentomaru and Dofi are Fire Fist bait, but this is a consistent deck and Zoro's a consistent deck, so really it just comes down to resource management, seeing the cards that you need. another matchup that you can take advantage of some of the unique mechanics that Blue provides is against decks like Smoker or Rob Lucci. So a lot of the black decks like Smoker or Rob Lucci kind of rely on characters that cannot be KO'd by effects. So Blue has a unique mechanic to be able to bottom deck those instead. So getting rid of a Kokoro or a Boystyle or possibly the 5-drop 7k Smoker or the 3-cost Smoker as well. You can just bottom deck those with Blue, or you can just bounce them back to your opponent's hand. So black is typically a good matchup. They can remove your Centaur before you get bodies on the board, but if they're doing that, then you have hand advantage compared to them. So yeah, I do think that black is typically favorable for Crocodile and Doflamingo decks. Just basically play your game, throw out your Centaur, they get rid of it. That's fine, throw out another one, or just start dropping bodies manually. Eventually they're going to work themselves out of hand, and you can just go into their characters before you go after their life and use your own momentum to your favor. The bottom decking cards like the 9-drop Mihawk and the 3000 Worlds, and your bounce effect with your leader ability or Soga King, and that should be a matchup that you're able to win more often than not. So I do think that black is favorable for Crocodile. But yeah, that about does it for this deck profile on Crocodile. I do think that this is a deck that can keep up with the meta. It's really consistent, and my only concern is maybe Fire Fist being able to easily deal with Centaur, since he's such an important part of your deck. And that's why I might give the edge to Doflamingo, because Doflamingo can swing aggressively with leader and put characters into play, and that's a better way to flood the board, and it's a little bit more value than what Centaur provides. But Crocodile having that built-in leader ability to bounce a character kind of balances that out a little bit. Like I said though, I do think I prefer Doflamingo, but Crocodile is right there with it. Also, I forgot to mention that this is definitely a deck that is worth investing in right now. I think this deck and all blue decks get a lot better in the future sets. We're going to get access to Gum Gum Red Rock, which gets to bottom deck any character for 6 cost, and that's amazing. And then you get the 10-drop Kaido, and then Sasaki, the 2k counter. So blue is getting some support in these future sets, which is really good to see. So I do think that Crocodile is a deck that is worth investing in. So might as well get the head start and start playing it now to get a feel for it. It's a strong deck, like I said. It can definitely win a locals tournament, if nothing else. But yeah, that does it for this deck profile. Give this video a like if you enjoyed it, and definitely go check out the live gameplay video I have with this deck versus Katakuri that I uploaded last week, because it's a really good match, a really close one, and it shows what Crocodile can do against one of the more popular meta decks. So yeah, that does it for this one. Make sure you subscribe for more One Piece card game content, and I'll see you all in the next video.